Kwesi Aning, Research Director at Tech, who will speak about broader security issues in West Africa. Thank you, Kwesi.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Okay, is it working?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let me say a good afternoon to you all, and what a pleasure to be back. I haven't been back for 20 years, so it's nice to see old colleagues and certainly make new friends. I'm going to do about 4 or 5 things. First, contextualize why West Africa must not and cannot, and under no circumstances, be split from the Sahel. Secondly, I want to talk about the broad issues that we are seeing. The attacks, the way they are being transformed. I want to talk about the characteristics. And then speak a bit about the international efforts. Disjointed, rhetorically very interesting, but operationally not very effective. Then finally, I want to talk about Ghana. Probably the most stable West African country, but then to ask myself the question and for all of us to discuss based on what I will present, the extent to which this problem is gradually coming down and encircling us. So I've actually conflated the title of this seminar, that the security situation in West Africa and the Sahel is somewhere between a powder keg, but certainly also, as the commandant ended, on the path to peace. West Africa certainly does remain one of the most contentious and fragile regions on the African continent. And certainly the 21st, or the first years of the 21st century has seen many parts of the sub-region facing very terrible challenges. We've seen Senegal going through a very contentious election, Liberia, fairly successful, Sierra Leone, successful election, increasingly contentious. We are seeing Guinea still struggling, La Côte d'Ivoire also struggling. A couple of days ago, youth violence, terrorist attacks. But we've been also dreaming somehow, unwilling sometimes and incapable of looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying the truth. So the attacks in Benin have not come as a surprise. The continuing violence in Togo is also not a surprise. The analysis, I will argue, have been fairly faulty. It's been seen as a struggle for democracy. I argue it's a representation of the jihadism that the commandant has spoken about. So all in all, although some progress has been made in terms of consolidating democracy and peace over the past decade and a half, the region continues to be fraught with multiple security challenges, which are not only national in scope, but increasingly interdependent, embedded, and transnational. But I think that one point we need to make clear, that these threats are not new. There's absolutely nothing new at all. They've existed at least for over 2 decades. All that we are seeing now is that the frontiers of the global war on terror are beginning to shift south. So let me talk a bit about the terror that we see. Security in West Africa and the Sahel broadly will continue to be very tenuous with the prevalence of activities of both Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the Masina Liberation Front, Boko Haram, Islamic State in the West African province, and they will continue to threaten northern Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, Benin, Togo, and Burkina Faso. People wonder about why Burkina Faso. I'm far from surprised. Because Burkina Faso's role in the terrorist infrastructure of West Africa and the Sahel goes way back to when Ambassador Norman Fowler was kidnapped in Niger. It was when Blaise Compaoré, the former president of Burkina Faso, left power, that the facade of Burkina Faso's stability and Burkina Faso as a peacemaker started to fall apart. The democratic leadership of Burkina Faso's unwillingness and unpreparedness to cut dirty deals with the terrorists is why the terrorists are beginning to behave the way they are in Burkina Faso. Two dynamics that we see in Burkina Faso. They will not attack Ouagadougou, because that is where the international community is, and it may be difficult as a strong force. They will also bypass Po, where the special forces are. So if you see the drive down south, Ouagadougou is fairly encircled, Po is fairly encircled. Northern Ghana is increasingly very dangerous. So what figures do we see? Let me just try to disaggregate some of them for you. If we ask the types of weaponry being used, we see the old boogie of West Africa, small arms and light weapons. Easily available, very cheap, easy to break into stockpiles. So the small arms are being used massively. Second factor that we see is the disturbing use of improvised explosive devices. Because stockpile management across the whole of the sub-region is terribly weak, it's easy to get access to explosives. And so far, the conversations around improving marking, tracing, and stockpile management is very weak. So what we are seeing in Burkina Faso both represents the old, the new, and the future. The attacks on the churches are going to continue primarily because it's a deliberate manipulative process of creating societal tensions that covers the strategy of the terrorists. But it's not only that, there is a larger narrative that underpins what we are seeing both in West Africa and the Sahel. The farmer herder crisis that we see across the whole of the Gulf of Guinea and then in the Sahelian belt, of herders becoming increasingly the victims and developing a narrative of victimhood, of exclusion, and of dispossession. Powerful narrative that allows them to mobilize and allow or also to radicalize them. So, what do we see? If we take West Africa, in the last 6 months, it's seen the highest number of terrorist attacks. A total of 69%, representing all the attacks that we have seen, both in the Sahel and in West Africa. Who are those who are being attacked? From the work that we do with the African Union's Center for Research on Terrorism, the primary targets are the military forces, government officials and institutions, and this is not something that is done in isolation. The state is still weak, it's exclusionist, terribly elitist, and therefore any attempt at attacking both government institutions and its representatives are perceived as legitimate. But we see international organizations also becoming fair game. Of course, civilian attacks form also a very high percentage. So how do we begin to bring this picture together? I argue that both Mali and Burkina Faso have become now the central focus of the terrorist threats. Because of what we see, I want to share with you about 5 or 6 broad characteristics that should drive the conversations that we are going to have. First, we are going to see an increasing number of attacks both in Burkina Faso, Mali, Northern Ghana, La Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, and Benin, focusing on very soft targets. Churches, offices, schools. We're also going to see the performance of lone wolves. Individuals in these groups desperate to be recognized as important players. We will see the spread of the extremist narrative. precisely because of the nature of politics that allows or almost disallows politicians from confronting this threat. We see two groups, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, becoming increasingly powerful in West Africa. We see the increased number of mosques being built, of radical preachers crisscrossing the Sahel and West Africa, and preaching an extremely conservative form of Islam. We are seeing the moderate forms of Islam that allowed Christians, animists, and Muslims to live in communities increasingly giving way to conservative Salafist and Wahhabist ways. This is going to be long term. The Saudis have the money, they have the organizations, they are first on the ground when there is a crisis. So, before I come to the international and the Ghanaian side, the story from West Africa is fairly straightforward, but it is very disturbing. Mukhtar Belmokhtar and his team will continue to pose veritable problems. We are seeing close partnerships, relationships amongst these groups. I've said earlier on about the role of lone groups. They will continue to attack, hoping to get the recognition that they want. Third, I think we need to question and discuss the role of France. I think it's important. And that tied in to some of the international efforts around the multinational joint task force and the J5 Sahel. I think I will leave that to my colleague to speak to. Another point I want us to focus on relates to the narrative, the discourses. What are the narratives and the messaging that happens when these attacks take place? More often than not, we only look at the broad statement that has been made and then we leave it at that. But when we disaggregate those messages, what we are seeing in Burkina Faso then is not a surprise. Consistently, both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have threatened those who have sent troops to Mali and those who send peacekeepers to fight them. So Burkina Faso, Mali, and increasingly the northern part of Ghana, as I have said earlier on, is becoming a problem. Nigeria's role in all this, what the commandant said, and ECOWAS's role becomes even more important when we look at the challenges. Pete, how am I doing?
You're doing very well.
Excellent. I'm an old school teacher, so I only know Go. Normally
I'll stop you, don't worry.
You're always very bad. You know, so these challenges are going to be there. But Nigeria, even with its challenges, is a major player in the ECOWAS story that the commandant told. ECOWAS cannot and will not survive without Nigeria. But the Boko Haram challenge is huge. So let me talk a little bit, very briefly, about the international risk response. We as a training center have never trained the J5 Sahel as a J5 Sahel. But individual soldiers from those countries, Mauritania, Mali, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, both from the military and then from the police, routinely will come through the Kofi Annan Center for training. There's too much disorganized response to the challenges that we are seeing in the Sahel and in West Africa. I think while the J5 Sahel is useful too, the security first approach, I argue, is too narrow and doesn't tackle the weak infrastructure of the state its capacity to respond to the criminal activities are weak. Let's not forget that for more than a decade, the criminals in quite a number of these countries actually have represented the state, collecting taxes, providing social welfare goods, intermarriages, providing schools. So it's just not a military first approach that will cut it. We need a broader, more nuanced, sophisticated approach to looking at these problems. But there are two things that I want to mention very quickly. One relates to climate change and its security impacts across the sub-region. More often than not, it's seen as a tangential part. I think we want to bring it back into the center because food security across West Africa and the Sahel is going to be a problem. The second, because of time that I cannot go into, is the issue of the demographics. When Ghana got independence in 1957, the Ghana's population was the same as the population of this country. 61 years on, we are what, about 33 billion? That is if we have counted correctly. The demographics are a problem. And if we are doing well in Ghana, you can compare Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and Mali. I will leave the Chad to my colleague to speak about. But is it possible for a country that boasts about being a middle-income country that wants to move beyond aid to be able to protect itself from the rather pessimistic narrative that I have said? I want to ask a broad question that I think during the conversation we can talk about. And that is, should Ghana be worried? If we wanted to look at what I've said about in a counterfactual manner and say, what will these groups seek to do to promote themselves more? Then Ghana becomes a very attractive target. And why so? It's a regional powerhouse. I think we will have the fastest growing economy this year all over the world. The middle class is booming. Business is good. It's pro-Western. It's a major peace and troop contributing country. We provided troops for MINUSMA in Mali. We are a key AFRICOM, ACOTA, and ACRI partner. We are also a key partner in the global war on terror. Actually accepted some of the Guantanamo Bay detainees. So if you were a jihadist, having conquered Burkina Faso, having attacked Mali, Chad, La Côte d'Ivoire, I think Ghana becomes a very attractive target. And I think the commandant is here, so he will answer all your questions as to how he's protecting you. But we are also having some very sketchy facts about recruitment from Ghana and Ghanaian schools to jihadist courses. We are hearing stories about foreign terrorist fighters seeking to come back. Some have been detained in Germany, UK, and Spain. But we have our own internal political tensions also. Of course, small arms are in abundance. So how do we explain this complex mix of hope and of despair? 3 quick points and I'll sit down, because I know there's nothing you like much more than to order me to sit.
I love to hear you talk as well, so it's fine.
First is that I think we need to understand the multiple interpretations and discourses that those who seek to play the role of the state present. Because the state in all the countries we are talking about, with the exception of a couple of the Gulf of Guinea states, have not been able to deliver on social welfare goods. People use the narrative of the provision of security first and foremost, and the provision of social welfare goods to be able to attract those who support them. And during the question and answer session, we will share some of the work that we have done. But we also need a much more nuanced, differentiated understanding of the regional dimensions of the threats that we are talking about. And I am happy that Maya will be talking about all these so-called young people that have been demobilized and the politics around their numbers. But a better understanding of the drivers and the enablers. What is it that becomes so attractive that it drives these people to do what they do? What are the challenges and opportunities for long-term planning and resourcing the commandant and his team to be able to respond? It's very fascinating for people to say, oh, the African military is very weak. But I think we need to go back to the 1980s, to the introduction of structural adjustment and the politics around structural adjustment that almost made resourcing the military almost like a crime. And the whole international community is now paying the price for it. Of African militaries that have been undermined so much so, under-equipped, underfunded for 30 years. The challenge that we face is that we need a better understanding and disaggregation of all these very complex points. Finally, I think it's crucial and important for the work that we do, and most importantly, the nexus between the research and the policy side, to identify, as I've said earlier, on the drivers, the enablers, and the processes that will point us to a better understanding of what is happening. A purely political lens that seeks short-term solutions will not be able to do it. This is a bigger and better, much more dangerous problem than both West Africa and the Sahel has ever seen. Thank you.